Hi everyone, welcome once again to my podcast You, Me and Tech. I'm Shubham, your host. This is the second episode of the first season, and in this episode I'll once again tell you an interesting story about history of universe. So let's get started. As long as 340 BC, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his book On the Heavens, was able to put forward two good arguments for believing that the earth was a round sphere rather than a flat plate. First, he realized that eclipses of moon were caused by the earth coming between the sun and the moon. The earth's shadow on the moon was always round, which would be true only if the earth was spherical. If the earth had been a flat disk, the shadow would have been elongated and elliptical. Unless the eclipse always occurred at the time when the sun was directly under the center of the disk. Second, the Greeks knew from their travels that the North Star appeared lower in the sky when viewed in the south than it did in more northerly regions. From the difference in the apparent position of the North Star in Egypt and Greece, Aristotle even quoted an estimate that the distance around the earth was around 400,000 stadia. It is not known exactly what the length a stadium was, but it may have been about 200 yards, which would make Aristotle's estimate about twice the currently accepted figure. Aristotle then gave the idea that our planets revolve around the sun. This idea was elaborated by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD into a complete cosmological model that the earth stood at the center, surrounded by 8 spheres that carried the moon, the sun, the stars, and the 5 planets known at that time: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The planets themselves moved on smaller circles attached to their respective spheres in order to account for their rather complicated observed path in the sky. So this was the understanding that was available about the universe in Aristotle's time. Because there were less resources to prove these theories by observation, the understanding was also confined. But philosophers of that time were the most logical people and were considered the people of high importance. If we further come closer to our time, in year 1609, Galileo started observing the night sky with a telescope, which had just been invented. When he looked at the planet Jupiter, Galileo found out that it was accompanied by several small satellites or moons that orbit around it. This implied that everything did not have to orbit directly around the Earth as Aristotle and Ptolemy had thought, but rather different motion planets is possible. At the same time, Johann Kepler also observed that the similar motion of planetary satellite, and thereafter he gave his new theory by modifying already known Copernicus theory, suggesting that the planets move not in circles but in ellipses around the sun, not around the earth. But people were very much hesitant in accepting Kepler's model at the time, and for a long time it remained buried without any other facts. But an explanation to this was provided only much later in 1687 when Sir Isaac Newton published his Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, probably the most important single work ever published in the physical sciences. In it, Newton not only put forward a theory of how bodies move in space and time, but he also discovered that complicated mathematics needed to analyze those motions. In addition, Newton postulated a law of universal gravitation, according to which each body in the universe was attracted towards every other body by a force that was stronger the more the massive bodies and the closer they were to each other. Because of this discovery, Copernican model got rid of Ptolemy's celestial spheres. It became natural to suppose that the fixed stars were objects like our sun, but very much farther away. Newton realized that according to his theory of gravity, the stars should attract each other. So it seemed they could not remain essentially motionless. Would they not fall together at some point? In the defense to his theory, Newton gave the argument as there were an infinite number of stars distributed more or less uniformly over the infinite space, the collapse would not happen because there would not be any central point for them to fall to. The correct approach it was realized only much later, is to consider the finite situation in which the stars all fall in each other, and then to ask how things change if one adds more stars roughly uniformly distributed outside this region. According to Newton's law, the extra stars would make no difference at all to the original ones on average. So the stars will fall in just as fast. We can add as many stars as we like, but they will still always collapse into themselves. Another objection to the infinite static model was given by German philosopher Heinrich Olbers. The difficulty is that in an infinite static universe, nearly every line of sight would end on the surface of a star. Thus, one would expect that the whole sky would be as bright as the sun, even at night. Olbers' counter-argument was that light was distant from stars would be dimmed by absorption by intervening matter. However, if that happens, the intervening matter would eventually heat up and until it glowed brightly as the star. But still, Newton's theory was widely accepted generally because of its simplicity and ability to explain all the possible scenarios. In the counter argument to Olbers' objection, Newton commented that it is possible that those stars are not active from the beginning but are just set up finite time from now, so that the light of most of the stars is yet to reach us and the matter around us is yet to be heated up. In 1676, a Danish astronomer Ole Christian Rømer discovered that the light has a finite speed. He observed that the times at which the moon of Jupiter appeared to pass behind the Jupiter, they were not evenly spaced, as one would expect if the moons went round the Jupiter at a constant rate. As the Earth and the Jupiter orbit around the Sun, the distance between them varies. Rømer noticed that the eclipse of Jupiter's moon appeared distant the farther we were from the Jupiter. He argued that this was because the light from the moons took longer to reach us when we were farther away. His measurements of the variation in the distance of the Earth from Jupiter were, however, not very accurate, and so his value for the speed of light was 140,000 miles per second, compared to the modern value of 186,000 miles per second. Nevertheless, Rømer's achievement is not only proving that the light travels at a finite speed, but also in measuring the speed was remarkable. These discoveries took interesting turn when in 1865, a British physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, succeeded in unifying the partial theories that up to then had been used to describe the forces of electricity and magnetism. Maxwell's equation predicted that there could be wave-like disturbances in the combined electromagnetic field, and that these would travel at a fixed speed, like ripples in a pond. If the wavelength of these waves is a meter or more, they are what we now call as radio waves. Shorter wavelengths are known as microwaves or infrared. Visible light has a wavelength of between only of a centimeter. Even shorter wavelengths are known as ultraviolet, X-rays and gamma rays. All observers should measure the same speed of light, no matter how fast they are moving. Simply, the idea has some remarkable consequences. Perhaps the best known are the equivalence of mass and energy, summed up in Einstein's famous equation E is equals to mc square, where E is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light, and the law that nothing may travel faster than the speed of the light. Because of the equivalence of energy and mass, the energy which an object has due to its motion will add up to its mass. In other words, it will make it harder to increase its speed. This effect is only really significant for objects moving at a speed close to the speed of light. So it takes more and more energy to speed it further. It can in fact never reach the speed of light, because by then its mass would have become infinite, and by the consequence of equivalence of mass and energy, it would have taken an infinite amount of energy to get it there. For this reason, any normal object is forever confined by relativity to move at speed lower than the speed of light. Only light or other waves that have no intrinsic mass can move at the speed of light. Equally remarkable consequence of relativity is the way it has revolutionized our ideas of space and time. In Newton's time theory, if a pulse of light is sent from one place to another, different observers would agree on the time that the journey took, but will also agree on how far the light traveled. Since the speed of the light is just the distance it has traveled divided by the time it has taken, different observers would measure different speed of light. In relativity, on the other hand, all observers must agree on how fast light travels. They still, however, do not agree on the distance the light has traveled. So they must therefore now also disagree over the time it has taken for us to measure. Therefore, he argued, if we found such stars in other galaxies, we could assume that they had the same luminosity, and so calculate the distances to that galaxy. If we could do this for a number of stars in the same galaxy, and our calculations always gave the same evidence, we could be fairly confident of our estimate. For the vast majority of stars, there is only one characteristic feature that we can observe: the color of their light. Newton discovered that if light from the sun passes through a triangular shaped piece of glass called a prism, it breaks up into its component colors, as in a rainbow. By focusing a telescope on an individual star or galaxy, one can similarly observe the spectrum of the light from the star or galaxy. We find that a certain very specific colors are missing from stars' spectra, and these missing colors may vary star to star. Since we know that each chemical element absorbs a characteristic set of very specific colors, by matching these to those that are missing from a star's spectrum, we can determine exactly which elements are present in the star's atmosphere. If we come back to Maxwell, he told that visible light consists of fluctuations or waves in the electromagnetic field. The wavelength or the distance from the one wave crest to the next of light is extremely small, ranging from 4 to 710 millions of a meter. A source of light at a constant distance from us, such as a star, emitting waves of light at a constant wavelength. Obviously, the wavelength of the waves we receive will be same as the wavelength at which they are emitted. Suppose now that the source starts. When the source emits the next wave crest, it will be nearer to us, so the distance between the wave crests will be smaller than when the star was stationary. This means that the wavelength of the waves we receive is shorter than when the star was stationary. Correspondingly, if the source is moving away from us, the wavelength of the waves we receive will be longer. In the case of light, therefore, this means that stars moving away from us will have their spectra shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. In the years following his proof of the existence of other galaxies, Hubble spent his time cataloging their distances and observing their spectra. At the time, most people expected the galaxies to be moving around quite randomly, and so expected to find as many blue shifted spectra as red shifted ones. It was quite a surprise, therefore, to find that most galaxies appear to be red shifted. While Einstein and other physicists were looking for ways to avoid general relativity's prediction of non-static universe, the Russian physicist, a mathematician, Alexander Friedman, instead set about explaining it. Friedman made two very simple assumptions about the universe: that the universe looked identical in whichever direction we look, and that this would be true if we were observing the universe from anywhere else. From these two ideas alone, Friedman showed that we should not expect the universe to be static. All of these Friedman solutions have the feature that at the same time in the past, the distance between the neighboring galaxies must have been zero. At the time which we call the Big Bang, the density of the universe and the curvature of the space-time would have been infinite. By now it was quite sure that infinite static universe is not possible. It should be an expanding universe, infinite in size, and started at a specific singularity. But still there was a need of all this to be proved mathematically, and this was done by two scientists, Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking. British mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose gave a theorem that anybody undergoing gravitational collapse must eventually form a singularity. Soon Stephen Hawking realized that if one reversed the direction of time in Penrose's theorem so that the collapse become an expansion and the condition of his theorem would still hold, provided the universe were roughly like a Friedman model on large scales at the present time. Penrose's theorem had shown that any collapsing star must end in a singularity. The time reversed argument showed that any Friedman-like expanding universe must have begun with a singularity. For technical reasons, Penrose's theorem required that the universe to be infinite in space. Remarkably, Hawking used it to prove that there should be a singularity only if the universe was expanding fast enough to avoid collapsing again. He proved all this in mathematical terms, so everybody then agreed to his findings and Big Bang theory became the successful theory in explaining the beginning of the universe. Thank you so much. I hope every one of you must have enjoyed this story. I'll be soon talking to you about related topics such as black holes, general theory of relativity in the next episode. Till then, you can watch my first episode, History of Electricity. So then, good.